At the tail end of Pokémon's second generation in the summer of 2002, I was born. And I can only assume that Game Freak was pressured by this momentous event to deliver more than they ever had before, as they proceeded to release their third generation's premier titles Ruby and Sapphire the following holiday season. As I was taking my first steps into this ever-confounding world, Game Freak was taking their first steps into the next echelon of handheld gaming, the Game Boy Advance. In the same way that the GBA was a natural evolution of the original Game Boy family of systems, Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire proved to be bigger and better versions of the previous main series entries in virtually every regard. In particular, one of the most fundamental improvements that was actually made possible by the Game Boy Advance in the first place was the enhanced graphics. These titles brought more pixels, more colors, more frames per second than ever before, allowing the player to experience this beloved fictional world with an unprecedented level of detail. You can really feel every pocket, every monster. Look at this thunderstorm. Look at this cutscene. Look at this puddle. Look at the puddle. Also, I'm honestly kind of surprised I didn't mention this in my previous two Pokemon retrospectives, but the music in these games is fantastic. It's just as melodically and harmonically satisfying as its predecessors, if not more so, and it also introduces a world of new timbres thanks to the GBA's added sound channels, the brass ensemble of horns and trumpets being among the most notable. I think many would agree with the notion that the transition from Gen 2 to Gen 3 is arguably the largest leap in quality that the main series has ever seen, and this phenomenon is due in no small part to the wealth of new quality of life features that were inaugurated in Ruby and Sapphire. The Pokénav was an elegant upgrade of Gold and Silver's Pokégear device, and the menus of these games in general are extremely frictionless. They feel really good to navigate. And I will never not be amazed by how Game Freak was able to overhaul the entire PC system and comprehensively perfect it in one fell swoop. Seriously, the PC in Pokemon games has been flawless since 2002. They nailed it on their first try. Or, third try, I guess? It is one of those things that seems easy to take for granted after having it for so long, but this interface is instrumental to streamlining the fundamental collection process that Pokemon is all about at its core, as well as serving as a sorely needed remedy for the infamous pitfall of needing to manually switch boxes upon reaching capacity in order to catch new critters. I have heard far too many cautionary tragedies of players catching legendaries or shinies in previous generations only to lose them because their default storage box was full. Thankfully, I never had that problem as a kid because catching every Pokemon was never really a priority of mine, so my box more often than not consisted only of a certain red serpent and a very frisky tree. Oh my god, thank Christ there's more bag space. Anyway, long story less long, Generation 3 brought a new level of polish to the franchise that arguably wouldn't be topped until Black and White. And not only is the content smoother, but there's also just way more of it, particularly in the post-game. There are plenty of cool and fancy and, dare I say, nifty legendaries to chase around after the Elite Four, and the quest to get a golden trainer card with all 4 stars is a compelling way to concretize the player's achievements in a satisfying manner. That is, if you don't get lost in Mirage Island. Or better yet, the Trick House. It's been months since I've felt the sun's rays on my skin. But of course, there is one area in which Ruby and Sapphire's innovations indelibly transformed the Pokemon series for the better, and that is the battle system. Generation 3 is quite possibly the single most important generation when it comes to the development of the combat mechanics in these games. Not only did they introduce crucial mainstays like abilities, natures, and double battles, it's crazy that all 3 of these things were added in the same game, by the way, but they also made custom chibi sprites for every single Pokemon, which did wonders for the in-battle UI. And the fact that they made passive damage like poison and burn resolve at the end of the turn rather than immediately after the Pokemon moves is just another one of those little things that contributes to the polished quality of the gameplay loop as well. Speaking of refining the competitive side of the gameplay though, perhaps the most creative addition this generation had to offer was the dazzling debut of contests. These theatrical events gave the player a fun side activity to complement their Pokemon League challenge, and the power system by which they're carried out is remarkably robust. In a way, it's just as fleshed out as the battle system, despite contests being secondary to the gym battles by nature. Like, a group of Game Freak designers really had to sit there going through every single move and assign each one a statistical distribution based on how cool, beautiful, cute, clever, and tough they are. My personal goal is to eventually be described with each of these 5 adjectives at least once, and I've already got 2 in the history books. Still waiting on cool, beautiful, and tough, though. Wait, does it count if the words not very came before them? Nonetheless, I think we can agree that contests are an awesome addition, and it even made the anime more interesting by giving Ash's friends more compelling and quantifiable goals than becoming a great water trainer. Oh gosh, wait, Misty's gone. She was replaced by May and Max? And why does Ash have drip now? Well, in any case, Ruby and Sapphire are without a doubt extremely formative titles in the context of the franchise as a whole, particularly when it comes to establishing precedents that would eventually become traditions of the series, like putting the legendaries on the box art, letting the player choose between one of two rock-type fossils, introducing a new Pikachu clone for every region, and prohibiting gym leaders from specializing in dark types for some reason. But something that the Hoenn games stand out for probably more than any other region is just that. The region itself. The Hoenn region boasts a staggering amount of diversity compared to Kanto and Johto, as exemplified by the rainforests, deserts, volcanoes, and consequently ash-ridden paths featured in its topological repertoire. Inclement weather has also been added in the overworld, including the introduction of hail, and the player can find and plant new kinds of berries in the overworld as well, both of which count as innovations to the battle system, by the way. Navigating the Hoenn region in general is just so much fun. It feels like a playground obstacle course teeming with mysteries and trinkets around every corner, especially with the advent of secret bases. But not only is the region's rich character practical for the player's enjoyment, it's also symbolic. Ruby and Sapphire make it an express point to emphasize its geographical setting as an integrated component of its themes. And yes, 7.8 too much water, funny IGN meme, funny internet moment, plus ratio, etc, but the reason so much of Hoenn is comprised of sea roots is because the game is trying to illustrate the idea of balanced relationships in nature. For every land, there is sea. For every yin, there is yang. For every X, there is Y. And, like, maybe a Z? Like, 12 years later? Alphabetical pettiness aside, though, do you see what I mean? The Hoenn region is literally a giant yin and yang symbol. Like, this is a very explicit motif. In fact, this theme of balance actually runs much deeper than just the region in which the games take place. The general idea of duality manifests in a surprising number of ways in Ruby and Sapphire. The aforementioned implementation of double battles is certainly a prime example, but we can also point out dynamic duos such as Tate and Liza, the Mach and Acrobikes, and now hold on to your hats for this one. The fact that the games were released in a pair? Well, okay, literally every other generation does that, but yet another manifestation of this is actually just the Pokédex itself, which is honestly a walking, talking example of duality in its own right. The amount of duos in this roster of Pokemon is genuinely monolithic. You have Beautifly and Dustox, Ninjask and Shedinja, Plusle and Minun, Volbeat and Illumise, Sharpedo and Camerupt, Zangoose and Seviper, Lunatone and Solrock, Cradily and Armaldo, Huntail and Gorobus, Latios and Latios. I mean, Jesus, this is the only generation with two different pseudo-legendaries. Hey, so I should probably talk about the story, huh? I would be hard-pressed to find a more apt example of duality in Ruby and Sapphire than the story itself, specifically via the pair of villainous syndicates Team Magma and Team Aqua, who plan to expand the continents for land-dwelling Pokemon and expand the sea for aquatic Pokemon, respectively. And if this sounds extremely idiotic to you, then I would encourage you to replay Ruby and Sapphire, because as someone who recently did so to get footage, I can attest to the fact that a second playthrough will absolutely confirm that opinion. And this is one of the aspects of the Hoenn games that make me hesitate to say that they flawlessly advanced the series without any missteps. While it is true that introducing these larger-than-life antagonists with globally existential ambitions raises the stakes to heights that they've never reached before, Maxie and Archie's motivations are unfortunately just profoundly stupid if you think about it even a little bit. And I understand that their character arc leads them to realize their wrongdoings in the end, but it just doesn't resonate with me because their plans were so obviously nonsensical on such a fundamental level that it seems like they never should have pursued them to begin with. I just have a lot of trouble taking them seriously with how short-sighted they consistently demonstrate themselves to be. And on a slightly tangential note, another instance of Ruby and Sapphire adding more stuff to the formula in a way that's not necessarily better is the fact that the player now interacts with two different rivals throughout their journey. May, or Brendan, depending on your choice of gender, and Wally. Now, Wally is actually a nice change of pace when it comes to the rival archetype because the rivals in the first two generations were, frankly, dickheads, whereas Wally is a likable underdog learning how to overcome his sickliness through the bonds with his Pokemon. It's a really inspiring story about one of the most sympathetic characters in the franchise that the player has the pleasure of obliterating in Victory Road at the end. And don't even get me started about May/Brendan. No, seriously, I actually don't know what to say about this piece of cardboard. But at least your dad is in your life. Or, sorry, he's in the game. Your dad is in the game. Now, speaking of things that are in the game... Alright, I'm sorry, that segue was inexcusable. The Pokédex in Generation 3 is yet another extension of this idea. I would describe this group of new Pokémon as very autonomous, in the sense that none of them are related to Gen 1 Pokémon, and in fact, the only creatures that are continuations of previous species are Wynot and Azurill. Unless you want to count the question mark and exclamation point variations of Unknown, but you don't want to do that. Or do you? In all seriousness, this is an incredibly solid roster of Pokemon, and it's impressive that there are 135 of them, but its autonomy is sort of a double-edged sword. Now that Pokemon titles were on the Game Boy Advance, trading with previous entries in the series was no longer possible, so getting your hands on Johto Pokemon was quite infamously difficult in Gen 3. Also, and I fully admit that this is a personal preference thing, but I find that some of the designs in the Hoenn decks are a little busy. I mentioned in my Gen 2 retrospective that I enjoyed the minimalistic quality of the first two generations' designs, but of course, that simplicity was a consequence of the games being more pixelated than they would inevitably become in the future. Now that Game Freak had a higher resolution to work with, they could freely increase the complexity of the designs without sacrificing readability. And while I agree with this creative decision in principle, I think the execution could have been slightly better in a few cases. With that being said, the cohort of Pokemon introduced in Generation 3 is one of the most consistent rosters in the series with respect to aesthetics, and wow, I just felt the overwhelming urge to talk about Team Aqua and Magma again, because Jesus Christ, they are so unfathomably stupid. Like, how could you possibly believe that drying the oceans or flooding the earth could ever possibly be a lucrative future for any living thing in the Pokemon world in any conceivable regard? Can't you see that your plan would spell certain calamity on a planetary scale? Can't you see how hard it is to control the power of Groudon and Kyogre? Can't you see that land and sea already coexist in mutual harmony? If not, then I implore you, sir, I implore you once again to look at this puddle. Look at how the water rests so gracefully, so naturally upon the land. The land providing a sturdy ground upon which the water can exist in perpetuity. The water providing nectarous nutrients to the ground below it so that it may grow into something beyond its original destiny. And the player, their reflection in the water. These goals of yours, yielding an almost incomprehensible scale, are they really worth the cost? You resolve to improve the world as we know it, but have you considered that you might be damaging it beyond repair in the very same breath? Could it be that your ambitions of advancement give rise to an inseparable sense of duality? Well, I don't know, man, but Pokemon Emerald's pretty cool. The third enhanced version of Ruby and Sapphire, Pokemon Emerald, was released 2 years later in 2004, and this game incorporated so many additions and improvements that it's commonly heralded by the fans as one of the greatest titles in the entire series. Not only does the story seamlessly weave together both evil teams in one grand conflict, but there are also some more subtle changes that enrich the player's experience quite tastefully, like being able to eventually get both fossils and Professor Birch giving you a Johto starter upon completing the Hoenn Pokédex. In fact, they even changed the champion from Steven to Wallace and introduced the water-type expert Juan as the new final gym leader. And even though you still get to battle Steven at Meteor Falls in the post-game, I find this to be a pretty bold move because they changed what is quite literally the final boss, just to spice things up a little bit, and I respect the audacity. My only qualm with Pokemon Emerald is that they replaced all of the contest halls with practice facilities except for one, so that every single contest is relegated to Lily Cove City. I actually really enjoyed getting to challenge a new contest hall as a kid every time I got to another major city in Ruby and Sapphire because it felt like its own subplot over the course of my journey, but I can definitely see why they were moved because the facilities that replaced them served as an excellent build-up to what is widely considered to be the greatest post-game activity in the entire franchise. The Battle Frontier. Come on down to Hoenn's very own Battle Frontier, an extravagant competition-fueled conference where trainers and Pokemon alike can become true Olympians by proving their mettle at 7 different facilities. Test your knowledge at Nolan's Battle Factory by forging unlikely partnerships with rental Pokemon. Test your guts at Greta's Battle Arena by outlasting your opponent in a series of 3 rounds in the ring. Test your tactics at Tucker's Battle Dome by competing in a scorching tournament bracket of 16 trainers. Test your luck at Lucy's Battle Pike by surviving surviving a sequence of treacherous scenarios with your party. Test your spirit in Spencer's Battle Palace by trusting your Pokemon's instincts to fight on their own without specific commands. Test your bravery at Brandon's Battle Pyramid by navigating several floors of danger in an RPG-style adventure. And test your ability at Annabelle's Battle Tower by facing skilled trainers from around the world one after another in a figurative and literal climb to the top. It's an unforgettable experience like no other, with glorious opportunities for any kind of Pokémon fan. And we thank you for choosing the Battle Frontier as your next vacation destination. We look forward to your visit, and may we facilitate the strengthening of your bonds with your Pokémon through the exhilarating crucible of combat. Oh, by the way, they had like a whole season in the anime dedicated to the Battle Frontier as well, which is, you know, that's pretty neat. The character arc that Ash undergoes in his journey to defeat the Frontier Brains is actually really poignant, especially in the Battle Pyramid, and this season in general is indicative of the fact that I could probably make an entire video about the Battle Frontier on its own. But with or without the Battle Frontier, Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald will always be some of the most beloved entries in the main series for how much innovation, polish, and overall solid gameplay they brought to the table, and I'm happy to add my voice to that choir without reservation. And although Game Freak might have bitten off a little more than they could chew with the story, it's undeniable that after the turn of the millennium, Pokemon's third generation pushed the boundaries of what we even thought possible by truly advancing the franchise beyond return.